But, when I talk with tech companies, I think they now generally understand that ethics matters. At least that's a start. They realize that there is significant reputational risk. A number of tech industries become essentially, tech companies rather, become toxic brands over the last few years. I know that, for instance, some of them struggle now to hire and retain talent as a result. It's very much still a candidates market in tech. So brand toxicity makes it very hard to hire and to keep the best people. And then also the press cycle has shifted against technology significantly in the last few years.
That was our guest today, Cennydd Bowles. Cennydd is a designer and futurist who's focused on the ethics of emerging technologies and formerly led design at Twitter UK. In this episode, Cennydd talks to us about the current landscape of digital ethics, including how we will see digital ethics in everyday technologies, the potential dangers of autonomous killer robots, and the incentives for people to think more deeply about digital ethics in their everyday lives. I hope you enjoy this episode with Cennydd Bowles. Cennydd, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you on, and I'm really fascinated to learn more about you and the work that you've been doing in digital ethics.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So Cennydd, introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit more about how you came to focus on this fascinating area of digital ethics.
Sure. So let's see. So I'm a designer and I now call myself a futurist as well. I've been in the design space for about coming up on 2 decades now. And during that time, I've worked with a number of tech companies. I've worked for government. I've worked in-house. I worked as a consultant. Essentially, I've been around a fair bit. A few years ago, I was at Twitter for 3 years. So I was a design manager there, so heading up the UK design team. And ever since then, my primary focus has been digital ethics, the ethics of emerging technology, particularly. Not necessarily as a some people, I think, expect that I had a moment of revulsion where I decided I need to turn against Silicon Valley, and it really wasn't that clear cut or that simple. I had a nagging suspicion that we as a community were missing something, that we really hadn't grappled with the ethical implications of our decisions and of our work. I was lucky enough then to have a chance to dive into that space and try to understand it better. And that was 5 years ago, and I haven't really looked back since. I keep finding new things to uncover, so it keeps me busy.
So Cennydd, I'm really thinking that it's probably cliche to say that you started to think more deeply about digital ethics once you started working at big tech, but I really want to pinpoint the time when you decided to make a deep dive and make this the focus of your career. So when would you say that point was when you started to really think about the ethics of digital artifacts?
Well, I've been lucky enough to have been giving talks for 10, 11 years, something like that I've been speaking publicly about these things. And people used to comment that they quite liked my talks because there was always an ethical theme running through them, which I hadn't realized. So my response was pretty much, "Oh, is there? I hadn't noticed." So I suppose it was something I always had a latent interest in, but probably what activated it the most for me was my time at Twitter. When I joined, this was back in 2012 now, and you'll remember that was essentially the year after the Arab Spring had really kicked off, or around that time anyway. And there was a techno-utopian narrative that social media and that the power of the smartphone was going to transform society, that it was going to uproot hierarchies and essentially empower the people for positive change. We subsequently have seen, of course, that it's done that to an extent, but it's also had significant negative impacts as well. And probably the first time I started to question my complicity in this was around 2014, when Gamergate really kicked off. If you're aware of Gamergate, it was essentially a misogynistic hate campaign against women in the games industry and people of non-binary gender identity, and so on. Ironically, it was actually undertaken under the guise of an ethics campaign. It was purportedly about ethics in game journalism. The idea being that people were taking bribes or receiving favors of certain kinds from people to give good coverage to their games, but it actually manifested as essentially a hate campaign. And I was pretty dismayed by our lack of action over it. And also the way that we, as a wider community, not just the company, but the technology industry, had failed to ask the right questions about how the things we build could be used for harm. So I tried to activate a little bit. I tried to push for internal pressure. I tried to push for wider awareness externally as well. And I suppose that was the moment then that really made me realize that some of the decisions I'd taken in my career, perhaps in retrospect, it's not that I wasn't necessarily proud of them, but I certainly would have done them differently had I thought more carefully and intelligently about the social and ethical consequences of those choices. And that was one of the factors that led me eventually into the path of writing a book. This whole idea of, only write books from whose absence you suffer. If I'd had a book like that 10 years ago in my career, I think I would have taken a very different course. So hopefully by spending time in that space myself, I can influence others.
So Cennydd, tell us a little bit more about the book that you've written that was self-published as well, because you wrote it in 2012, and that was a really important time in the digital landscape because the Obama campaign had just wrapped up. That was a seminal digital campaign. There was also the Arab Spring that was taking place. There were lots of really important digital milestones that were taking place at that intersection between the techno-social. So I'm really wondering, was it those cleavages that really drew you to start taking a deeper look at the research in this space?
Well, I think it was when I left Twitter, it was 2015.
Okay.
So by that time, some of those promises had started to show themselves to be a little bit shaky. I was fortunate enough, I hadn't made huge money off the Twitter flotation, but I made some. I'd sort of joke that I'm a Silicon Valley thousandaire. So I'd made a bit of money that meant I didn't have to rush into the next position. So I could take my time and see what was out there, take some contract work and just figure out my next step. And so I had the privilege, the luxury to say, well, I'm actually really interested in this ethics thing. Let's find out more about this and who's talking about it and how do we understand that better. And what I found when I opened the lid on that was there's a huge amount of work going on. There are people who've dedicated their professional and academic lives to the philosophy of technology, to science and technology studies, to anthropology, to all sorts of fields that have some quite strong opinions about the work of mainstream technologists, and that we hadn't really been listening to them. And I certainly hadn't. So that's why it then took me down this rabbit hole of research and understanding the work that was happening in these fields, trying to read Rousseau and Kant, and I have a physics degree, right? I don't have any philosophical training, so that was a learning experience, to put it mildly. But that's why essentially, I started diving into it and realized this thing goes deep. It was really only about 2016 that I decided I thought I eventually could write a book about this, to essentially translate some of that fine work that was happening, to contextualize that for working designers, working product managers and technologists, because I speak their language still. And then, of course, 2016 happened all around us. Being British, obviously, I was caught up in the Brexit debacle. And then, of course, Donald Trump got elected. And so a lot of people certainly started questioning whether the world was rotating in the direction that we thought it had, or that we thought everything was nice and stable and progressing in the way that we thought. And I think for a lot of people, 2016 was an unpleasant surprise. For some people, I'm sure it was a pleasant surprise as well, but I'm not one of these people. And so I think there was a lot of self-reflection among the tech community generally in 2016. And I had, already started dedicating a lot of my research time to this, and it lent further impetus to my work. But then also I think the technology industry's interest in reflecting on the ethical and social consequences and political consequences of its work. And so pretty much ever since then, the last perhaps 3-4 years, since roughly 2016-17, the ethical discourse in technology has become far more prominent.
So, given now that we're in 2020, what's your opinion on the state of the discussion of digital ethics in relation to when you started in 2012? Have we moved forward, do you think?
I think it's a very mixed picture. I think I'll talk about the positive signs I'm seeing first. The positive signs I'm seeing is that some of the academics who have been essentially banging their heads against brick walls for a couple of decades and saying, why on earth is the technology industry not paying attention to our work? I think some of those people are finally being heard. And there has been a little bit of a recent trend of moral philosophers being hired by tech firms, often not into the right position or often not really with any power to make change. So there are certainly accusations that sometimes this is ethics washing rather than fundamental rethinking of strategy. But when I talk with tech companies, I think they now generally understand that ethics matters. At least that's a start. They realize that there is significant reputational risk associated with screwing people over. I mean, we've seen a number of tech industries become essentially tech companies rather become toxic brands over the last few years. I know that, for instance, some of them struggle now to hire and retain talent as a result. It's very much still a candidates market in tech, so brand toxicity makes it very hard to hire and to keep the best people. And then also the press cycle has shifted against technology significantly in the last few years. So companies know that they will be challenged for the decisions that they take. So they realize they have to be more literate in ethics. The problem is they don't know how. They haven't built up that capability or that competence to be able to talk about ethics in a way that isn't just moral intuition. I have a hunch that this feels right, this feels wrong. And then the problem is it just becomes an internal argument. You have, well, I think this is fine, I think it's bad. Who wins? Well, it's usually the highest paid person in the room. So what companies I think are lacking is rigor in how they talk about ethics and the consequences of their work. And then that's not helped by, I think, some of the folks who are in the, let's call it the responsible tech movement, some of whom I admire greatly, some of whom I think are making fundamental mistakes in the way they're approaching it. The mistake I see probably the most frequently is to let ethics become overtly politicized. Now, I'm a person with fairly strong political views. Nevertheless, ethics should resonate with people wherever they sit on whatever political spectrum you choose to use. And I think too many people who are trying to push for ethical change within companies take too overtly a political stance on it. And the problem with that is it allows it to be easily dismissed. That it's just ranting from your usual extremist sources. And in the meantime, we can just ignore that and carry on with our plans. And that to me represents a failure state for ethical discourse. So it is right that we should acknowledge the political consequences of our actions. But for me, that's a slightly separate conversation from the ethical conversations we should also be having. So I think there is some promising progress, but it's taken a while for the market to get to a point of maturity where companies are really willing to tackle these issues. And then they're also starting to potentially, well, I don't want to say talk to the wrong people, because that sounds like I'm not bitter about it. I'm just concerned that the direction it will be. We have some real opportunities ahead of us as a responsible tech community, and I would hate to see us squander those opportunities.
One of the things that you'd mentioned is the shifting of the media cycle towards the technology companies, and I think more importantly, how people view their relationship with technology more generally. But I wonder what you think about the economic cycle also shifting towards a greater appreciation of digital ethics. And with that, I'm just referring to, for example, the way that staff in technology companies are now rising to activism when they see that the products they create have negative impacts on society, or the extent to which shareholders, for example, are campaigning against companies when, I don't know, when there's a cybersecurity breach or whenever the brand gets tarnished because of the negative impact that it has on society. So would you also say that the economic incentives are shifting towards a greater integration of digital ethics?
That's true. But it's a very complex situation. I could talk about this for a very long time.
Absolutely.
You're right that staff are starting to mobilize. I think my take is probably the biggest trend within the technology industry in the next 2 to 3 years will be not quite open war, but not far off between mobilized, collectivized tech workers and their executives. We've seen that most obviously at Google, but now there's an Amazon worker push for climate action. Microsoft have loose collectives around these sorts of things as well. So this is a trend that's happening for sure. You are right that there are potentially economic penalties for unethical decisions within companies, but not as many as there might be. There are plenty of companies who are fully aware that the things they're doing will fall short of some moral standard, but don't care because they will receive more profit for doing so. The fossil fuel industry, for example, is still, earning huge amounts of money from expelling massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and essentially foreclosing our futures as a result of it. And for all of their advertising about just how green their company really is, if you look at the dollar value of what's bringing in the revenue, it ain't the renewables, it's still the fossil fuels. Now, there may be consequences further down the line in terms of regulation. When it comes to the tech industry, more regulation is coming. That is guaranteed. The EU will probably lead the way, but I would say a federal privacy law in the US is probably no more than 5 to 10 years away. That's my guess. So there will be financial penalties essentially landed on the industry if they fail to self-regulate, which I think they are. But it can get tricky because at some point the company has to take a bold decision, sometimes to harm its revenue sources for the greater good. And that can be a very difficult conversation to have in some companies. Depends on the culture of the organization and of the leadership. There is, as I'm sure you're aware, this old sort of Chicago school model of economics, which harkens back to the mid-70s, I think. Milton Friedman wrote this article claiming that the only purpose of a business is to turn a profit for its shareholders, and that anything else was, I think his exact words were, unalloyed socialism. Any kind of social responsibility was just pure socialism. This is maybe where my politics does come through a bit. I find that a despicable way to consider the world and our economy and our responsibilities within it, and I think it's a grave ethical lapse as well. Fortunately, I think that view is on the way out. We've even had the Financial Times in the last 6 months say that capitalism needs a reboot towards more responsible outlooks to put genuine social responsibility at the heart of all enterprise. And so we're starting to see companies talk about the triple bottom line. We're starting to see companies drift towards, say, B Corp status. Generally, those make it easier to have the ethical conversation. But while there is still that perspective that ethics must always be subservient to profit, it's always an uphill battle.
So, Kenneth, earlier in the interview, you described yourself as a futurist. So, looking forward, How can you see digital ethics being integrated into some very core emerging technologies?
Yes, I'll talk about two that are quite strongly related. The first is AI. AI, of course, as we know, is a very broad label for a range of technologies. Um, but one of the most significant conversations that's going on is essentially around explainable AI, sometimes shortened as XAI, and just how much explanation a system needs to be able to provide to explain its actions, its decisions. So we, for example, a couple of years ago, we saw the Compass crime prediction algorithm. This was uh, mentioned by or analyzed by ProPublica, who carried out this large investigation, pointed out that it was more likely to predict that a black person was likely to reoffend than a white person. So we've had now many examples of AI systems or facial recognition systems, which are all really in the same ballpark, that are gender biased, that are racially biased, and so on. And it's good, at least, that conversation is now a little bit more widely known and understood, but we really still haven't grappled with the question of just how much that system should be held accountable for those decisions, and who, ultimately, who on the sort of human side should be accountable for that as well. So one of the big challenges is which systems need to be explainable, and how does that explaining actually happen? And if you design a system that cannot be explained, which is the case with a lot of deep learning systems, neural networks, and so on, although there are some people working on that, it's generally seen as very hard to explain those systems because it's mathematical weightings, essentially, that are highly abstracted. Then should those systems even be used in certain contexts and conversations? So there's a strong ethical discussion about the explainability of AI as part of a much wider focus on AI ethics. And there are people who talk about, the anthropomorphization of robots, for example, the ethical qualities of that. I think there have been some very strong cases made by people like Joanna Bryson to say that we actually shouldn't make humanoid robots because they impute a false sense of humanity and of agency in our models of these machines. So they cause us to behave in inappropriate or incorrect ways toward them. So there's a whole number of discussion points there. The other technology I'd like to talk about, which again is really an offshoot of AI, it falls still within that bracket, is autonomous weaponry, which is again certainly coming if we wish it. There are many companies already working on systems that are at least potentially capable of making decisions to kill without human intervention. Essentially, the technology exists already. It's facial recognition plus a gun, right? And we have both of those things. The facial recognition is less reliable than the gun right now, but there is no legal precedent for this. Of course, all legal frameworks for war have been written from a perspective that a human will be in control of the decision to fire or not fire. If we face a territory where that human is not in that loop, then that is a moral and legal minefield, if you'll pardon the sort of mixed military metaphors there. And so there's a campaign group called Stop Killer Robots, I think they're called, or something like that. Not a particularly subtle name, but they're obviously trying to campaign for those weapon systems to be made illegal. I think they ought to be illegal as well, or at least very tightly controlled or very tightly defined by exactly what we mean by an autonomous system, a lethal system, human in the loop, human out of the loop, and all these things that go with it. So that's just one example of a technology that is coming because of the result of another bunch of supporting technologies come together to create the possibility that this can happen, and then can surprise us completely. These are imminent. These are upon us in the next couple of years. And so we have to take very bold and swift decisions about the morality and legality of these systems. So that's the kind of work that I'm interested in provoking conversation around.
You did mention earlier, Kenneth, that companies are not rushing wholesale to implement digital ethics or integrate them into their differing products offerings. And is that a result of a skills gap, as you see it, or is it rather a lack of political will, for want of a better word?
I think it's a skills gap and an incentive gap. I think some of these companies are genuinely interested in social responsibility, for example, but that is mostly then localized within a CSR group. And there'll be some team or some couple of individuals who are responsible for that. But those conversations are very separated, very divorced from where digital product decisions are taken, and they're taken inside, um, design studios, in teams of engineers, in product management groups, and so on. It's one of the reasons that I'm not keen on the abstraction of, say, hiring a chief ethics officer for an organization, is that potentially, depends on how it's structured, but you could just be creating, again, this separation where you have some ivory tower exec overseeing something, but then really not understanding the decisions that are happening within the product organization and that the software engineers and designers are actually making. So there's no incentive for those teams to really consider ethics because they're not given any targets around ethics. Instead, they're given targets or OKRs, objectives and key results, that are around product growth or adoption rates or conversion in e-commerce flows or revenue or something like that. And until they're actually given that incentive, that reward system to encourage ethical behavior, then it doesn't really matter what a CSR team is saying or a chief ethics officer is saying. If it's not baked into how we appraise the work of those individuals, then it's not going to happen. And yes, there is also a skills gap because these folks have been hired mostly because of their sort of STEMish analytical capabilities. They're typically, and I say this, some of my best friends are technologists, but they're typically younger people who are not all that worldly wise, who are very intelligent, very smart, but not well traveled, not as experienced in humanity as perhaps other people would be. So they don't have those perspectives that help ethical conversation and help ethical discourse. They find it a little bit harder maybe to appreciate the impact of a decision on a group that they're not familiar with. People from different backgrounds, different countries, who speak different languages, have different life experiences. I think a lot of the folks in tech industries, because of their youth, have less knowledge of these, and so they're shielded from the potential implications and the harms that they could be throwing out onto these people. Which is why one of several solutions, is to think very carefully about diversity within tech teams, so that we avoid that pitfall of essentially designing for people like ourselves.
So although some of your best friends are technologists, and to the extent that you can share, how do you see different design practices changing to accommodate some of the topics that we've been discussing in digital ethics? Again, given that digital ethics is really increasing in popularity, both amongst lay people and technologists.
I think there are essentially two axes that we need to look at. There's a diagram I end up drawing for a lot of clients, which obviously I can't hear on a podcast, but essentially imagine you have a simple graph with an X and a Y axis. I think these two axes we're focusing too narrowly. The first one, then, the X-axis, we'll call that a time axis. So we've trained ourselves to focus mostly on the immediate perspectives of technology. If I push this button, what happens next? If we ship this feature, do we hit our Q1 targets, etc.? What we've not trained ourselves to do is to think about the consequences in a year, 5 years, a decade from now of, if this product is a wild success, then how does that change the world, right? So I think we have to get far more literate at talking about the future, and we have to be able to anticipate potential unintended consequences of our decisions over a longer time frame than we're currently interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens right now is we ship something, it creates all sort of positive and negative effects, and then in a couple of years' time, then we have to try to solve some of those negative effects. And we do that in exactly the same way by creating more short-term technology, throw more technology, more design at the problem, which creates more unintended effects, and so on. And the cycle repeats, and we never actually really make any progress there. So we certainly have to look on a longer time horizon. The other axis, the y-axis, is what I would call the actors in the system. And so I'm as you mentioned, I'm a designer. And for my essentially 2 decades of my career, I have always been taught and been trained to say we focus on the needs of the user. And that's fine. That's sensible. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's probably missing something because we've never really interrogated, well, who is that user? The user is, a lot of the time when it comes to tech, someone who's already privileged, affluent, high literacy, high net worth, and designing things that benefit that user may also harm people who aren't users. Airbnb is the classic example. Airbnb is a fantastic product if you have spare property or if you want to rent that property on a short-term basis, but it's terrible for everyone else. If you live next door to an Airbnb, you haven't got a neighbor anymore. You have a new neighbor every couple of days. They're not interested in forming a local community. They're going to spend their money in the tourist traps rather than in the local neighborhood and so on. So society, essentially, your neighborhood and your neighbors will pay the costs for Airbnb. So these externalities of the system are all loaded upon people that we just haven't considered. We haven't been designing for. We work for Airbnb, and those people have not been part of that discussion in the design process, I can guarantee, until perhaps recently. So we have to broaden our focus. Still, yes, we design for users, but we also need to consider what's the impact on people who aren't users. And then maybe even the impact on broader social structures that underpin the way we like to live. So democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, things like that. Certainly some of our digital products have harmed those concepts. And then maybe even we go further and we say, what's the impact also on non-humans? Animals have been routinely exploited by technologists over decades. I mean, Edison electrocuted stray animals to show the dangers of alternating current. We put Leica in orbit with no plan whatsoever of how to get it down there. And then, of course, there are environmental issues as well. Beyond that, still, there's not just other people, other life on the planet, but then the planet itself. And so this is where a whole host of environmental and ecological questions starts raising their heads. So for me, it's about broadening our perspective on both of those axes, thinking over a longer horizon of time, but then also broadening the scope of the actors that we think are important and that we should try to protect.
So would you say then that the techniques and tools that we currently have as designers and engineers, would you say that they're sufficient to take us into this digitally ethical future that we're describing?
No, they're not. User-centered design is not fit for purpose in the 21st century, particularly in an era of climate crisis. Designing for more, designing simply for users will encourage the same cycles of consumption, of degradation, and ultimately of destruction. So we have to find a way to get around that, to think more broadly. Now, this is going to take significant change. It's going to require us to transform a lot of our processes, a lot of our industry, and frankly, a lot of our society as well. Now, designers can absolutely help with that transition. We can help to create pictures of what that future might look like. We can create these hopefully hopeful, not necessarily utopias, but promising artifacts of a better world to come, and try to encourage people to say, here's what we need to do to affect that change, to reach that kind of future. But we're not going to be able to do that with simple user-centered design anymore. I'm not saying we'll ever stop doing UCD, but if it's the only mode of design over the next 2 decades, then we are truly lost.
So we've been speaking about digital ethics at quite a high level, but for people that are responsible on a day-to-day basis of operationalizing this, where would you say, or who would you say rather, is responsible for this? Should it be a standalone department, or should it just be the responsibility of one person or one group of people? Where do you think digital ethics sits in a company?
The obvious and trite answer is to say it's everyone's responsibility.
Mm.
The difficulty with that is it frequently then becomes no one's responsibility. And so we've seen this with any other kind of responsible program you care to name. There's that big question of, do you create a dedicated team? You see it even with innovation. Do we create a separate innovation hub or like an R&D or a labs environment? Or do we try to embed those practices within the entire org? But if I had to pick, I actually think it's product managers. That's from a tech company perspective. Those are the people whose minds I really want to change. It's difficult because product managers are typically the ones with the necks on their line for performance. Mm-hmm. So if the team misses its targets, then it's usually the product manager who will be blamed, and probably rightly, because that's their job. They tend to hold a lot of power as a result. And frankly, their power has only increased within tech companies in the last 10 years, to the extent that designers and even engineers have been a little bit squashed by that. I would love to see more ethical consideration within product management groups, to the extent that they are then empowered and emboldened to say to the broader business, we will not attempt to hit this target because it's harmful. Or we will propose counter targets that say, okay, we can hit that, but only if we also hit this one. Because it's very easy to game any target, usually at the expense of creating some harm elsewhere. So you could maybe say, well, we'll metricize both of these things. So if these both go up, we're making genuinely positive change rather than cutting corners to gain this target and then hurting our other benefits, if you like. So yeah, probably those folks. And what I particularly like about that is these teams are right at the crux of the critical decisions about where technology goes. It tends for me not to happen at the executive level. It also tends not to happen at the sort of junior practitioner level. For me, it's senior individual contributors, mostly in product, and it's also middle management. Sort of director level, senior director, senior manager, somewhere around that. In a large tech firm, the vice president and the CTO, whatever, they really don't know what's happening within those smaller teams. There's just too many layers. There's too much distance there. And I think some of them would be horrified at the decisions that are taken within those product teams. So that's really where I like to aim my focus. Now, there may well be a case to say, hire ethicists or hire, responsible tech ethics, responsible tech experts rather, to help guide that transformation, to help address skills gaps and introduce new processes for these teams, the product teams and the engineers and the designers as well. But I would be skeptical of any overly separated and sort of pedestalized, I know that isn't a word, but you see what I mean, group whose job it is to tackle that, who doesn't really have any influence on those type of decisions.
We were discussing earlier the importance and prevalence of cycles, and I'm wondering whether you think that this will apply to digital ethics. So just now it's kind of in vogue to talk about digital ethics, but when this cycle eventually changes, as it inevitably will, can you see the importance of digital ethics diminishing as a result?
To an extent, that's already happened. It didn't take a genius to see what was happening when the tech ethics movement really started to gain traction. It was very obvious that there was going to be a tech backlash, if you like. We've had the tech clash, but then there were going to be people saying, all right, this is too far now. This is neo-Ludditism. This is renunciation of progress. These people are just saying that we should go back and live in the woods, and it's of course that's not actually what folks are actually saying, but nevertheless, that characterization is quite easy to make. I think that incorrect politicization of ethics that I mentioned earlier makes that kind of easier as well. Makes it easier for people to disregard the tech ethics movement. That said, I think I'm not going to say it's a one-way valve, but I think it will be hard to fully reverse course, because I think the public is starting to get more attuned to these issues, and public sentiment is a bit harder to shift, particularly in certain countries. I mean, particularly Germany. There is grand skepticism of the motives of big tech firms, particularly when it comes to privacy and what some people call surveillance capitalism. And I don't see that returning. I don't see that going away. Rather, I don't see that course changing. I think also burgeoning interest and burgeoning recognition of immediate climate action will reinforce this public perception that things have to change, that we can't keep going the way we have the last few decades. So I think that collectively comes together to say this is actually a movement that's going to stay. One wildcard in that is I'd maybe refer back to that looming battle between tech workers and executives. The executives still hold the power there, so that might be a way that the tech firms bite back, essentially. And it also depends on who wins certain elections that are coming up. I mean, for example, a Sanders presidency will be very different than another Trump presidency for the United States, and we don't know which way that's going to go at the moment. So it's always a fool's errand to predict the future. But I would say I see signals that yes, there are challenges to this burgeoning movement, but I think the momentum is strong enough that it doesn't go anywhere anytime soon.
Can you talk, Kenneth, about the ways that digital ethics, or rather thinking about it, manifest differently around the world? Or is it really the case that actually there's one big monolithic understanding of digital ethics and how that should play out?
There are certainly a lot of cultural influences on this discussion that shift things. That can be that can make the ethical conversation more difficult, because we get into the realm of relativism there, where people essentially shrug and say, well, how do we even know? How can we say that some things, are good or bad? Isn't that just a matter of opinion? And I think relativism is sort of well-meaning, but doesn't get us that far when it comes to ethics. So that's a sort of pitfall that we need to avoid. But it is true that different groups of people and different cultures and countries have very different or fairly different views on what constitutes good and evil when it comes to innovation ethics. The EU has typically, certainly in my lifetime, has been more interested in the well-being of the society than the individual, compared to the United States. Obviously, the US is still a very individualist culture. Asia, again, these are sweeping generalizations, but Asia probably even more orientated toward the well-being of the society. Speaking of monolithic, there is a risk that we do become overgeneral. For example, there's a lot of conversation about the ethics of Chinese technology, and a lot of that in the West has a particular preferred narrative that it likes to lay out about China. And so those conversations tend to follow those lines. You may find a single province or a single council or whatever it, equivalent would be, has decided to trial facial recognition in one public lavatory. And then, of course, the headlines in the Western media are China is now enforcing facial recognition on people who wish to use the toilet. And it's like, okay, this is a not helpful generalization, but it is from my observations, largely true that particularly the Scandinavians, the Germans, are more aware, are more attuned to the potential threats that are posed by privacy infringing technologies. The United States tends to be a little bit more willing to let companies pursue innovation, and then to regulate only as a last resort, or to ask the industry to self-regulate first. Typically, when I'm talking with audiences or with companies, particularly within California, I'll often get objections essentially on libertarian grounds of, well, ethics is really an imposition on my freedom. So, I see what you're saying, but frankly, my freedom is a higher priority than this. And that's an argument I hear a lot less frequently in Central Europe. It's going to be interesting to see how those arguments develop, and particularly the kind of legal ramifications, because I say regulation's coming, but that's really only ever going to happen if citizens start demanding regulation, which is certainly starting. There is an open question of, in fact, whether the internet generally is able to continue in its current form, where you have at least three strongly diverging frameworks for future regulation. You have the EU, which is very keen to regulate, particularly on privacy. You have the United States, which is very reluctant to regulate. And then you have Asia, and again, particularly China, where obviously the state has a far tighter relationship with enterprise. It's sort of hard to tell the boundaries between them sometimes. And so some people theorize that maybe instead of one internet, we'll end up with three or more splinternets, where essentially the moral and then the legal frameworks or the governance models make them just completely incompatible. And so we'll have a US internet, an EU internet, and probably a Chinese internet, and then the rest of the world will figure out which model they want to plug into. So I think that conversation is going to get harder over time. Nevertheless, on the positive side, there are some aspects of ethics that we can largely agree on. Pretty much every culture agrees that, say, murder or adultery is a moral harm. 48 countries found enough common ground to co-sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which is very much an ethical and moral document. So I don't kid myself that it's going to be easy to achieve sort of harmonious development, but I think I see slightly more promising signs than some do, that we can find some common ground.
So I'm thinking that there might be some people who would say that digital ethics is a nice to have, that it's not really that important given the times that we're living in at the moment. So what would you say companies really have to gain by implementing digital ethics into everyday things that they're doing?
So you can certainly make business cases for this. There are really only ever three business cases in the world. You either increase revenue, you decrease cost, or you decrease risk. And you can make a case that businesses could benefit from all of those by considering ethics. You could differentiate your products. You could maybe raise margins. You could attract new customers with ethical alternatives. So that's your revenue side. Decrease costs from dissatisfied customers, from losing unhappy staff, for example. You could talk about that on the revenue, on the cost side rather. A lot of ethical discussion is framed in terms of risk, reputational risk, but also regulatory risk. If the industry really doesn't clean its act up, then it will be hit by punitive regulation, in a more forceful way than if it takes, self-governed decisions to try and improve things. So you can always talk about the business benefits to an organization, but I never like to just talk about the business benefits, because for me, again, that's a failure state for ethics. Because if you say ethics is important only because of the dollar value attached to it, then you're essentially saying that ethics should always be subservient to the profit imperative. And a lot of the time, it's the profit imperative that is the ethical problem, or that has caused, at least, the ethical problems. So I still like to take a maybe slightly idealistic stance and say this is also just a good thing to do for the world, for the planet. We are still humans. We are all on this world together. Um, and we have therefore a duty to each other to do more good in the world. Now I have the luxury that I'm an independent consultant, so I don't really answer to anyone on that. A company might hire me, but I still have the freedom to say that relatively free of consequences. But for me, I think we should never lose sight of that higher purpose to the things we make. Yes, everyone likes earning money, everyone likes generating profit, but ultimately what I really am motivated by is improving the human condition. And so I think we should always make sure that our focus is on that higher purpose.
And that's a really great spot to end. Kenneth, where can people find out more about you and your work and connect with you?
Oh, sure. So I have an unusually spelled name, but once you know the spelling, I'm very easy to find. So my website is cennydd.com. That's cennydd.com. My Twitter name is @Cennydd. Again, CENNYDD. And then my book, Future Ethics, just Google it and you'll find it easily enough.
Great stuff. Well, Kenneth, thanks for spending some time with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure. Cheers.